remarkable. Oh, yes, I have to ask your permission, Dr. Saini, to record your talk and host it internally. Is that okay?
Yeah, perfectly okay.
With
Thank you.
your permission, thank you. Um, and so, um, Dr. Vikas Saini is the director of the Lown Institute, which is a, give me 1 second, just pull this up. Um, Dr. Saini is a clinical cardiologist, and he was trained by Dr. Bernard Lown at Harvard. Those of you who remember med school, Lown, Ganong, Levine, and other things, he was a great cardiologist. Those of you in cardiology surely know his background. So he established the Lown Institute that Dr. Vikas Saini now is the president of. He leads the Institute's signature project, which is the Lown Institute Hospitals Index. It is the first ranking to measure hospital social responsibility. The index, which was first launched in July 2020, evaluates hospitals on the basis of equity, value, and outcomes, and includes very unique, never before used metrics such as avoiding overuse, pay equity, and racial inclusivity. In his role at the Lown Institute since 2012, Dr. Saini led the development of the Right Care series of papers, which was published by the Lancet in 2017. He has convened 6 national conferences, attracting more than 200 attendees annually and featuring world-renowned leaders in healthcare. And he has guided other Lown Institute projects, such as the Shkreli Awards, which are very interesting for those of you who know Martin Shkreli and his shenanigans. He's also the co-chair of the Right Care Alliance, a grassroots network of clinicians, patient activists, and community leaders organizing to put patients, not profits, at the heart of healthcare. Prior to the Lown Institute, he was in private practice in cardiology for over 12 years at Cape Cod, where he founded a primary care physician network participating in global payment contracts. And he also co-founded Aspect Medical Systems, the pioneer in non-invasive consciousness monitoring in the OR with the BIS device. I'm sure many of us are familiar with the BIS device and the BIS index. He's an expert on optimal medical management of cardiologic conditions, medical overuse, hospital performance and evaluation, and health equity. He has spoken and presented research at professional meetings around the world and is widely quoted. It is my pleasure to introduce the 4th DEI speaker this year, Dr. Vikas Saini. All yours, Dr. Saini.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation, Dr. Gidwani. It's an honor to be able to be with you. And I'm looking forward to sharing a lot of the work we've been doing in the last year or two. I'm aware that you all are, intensivists focused on clinical care primarily. And there are a lot of issues in terms of diversity and inclusion with regard to inpatient care and probably even critical care. There's literature. I'm not going to be talking about that today or reviewing it. But I certainly would recommend a review of some of that data if you all have not had a chance to look at it, because it's substantial. But today, I'm going to sort of go back to my own roots. I majored in philosophy. I studied a lot of history. And I think sometimes it's really helpful for us to be able to step back and widen the horizon and understand context, because that can often lead to much greater insight into the current moment. So that's what I'm going to do a little bit, and then talk a little bit about the Lown Hospitals Index, some of the methodology there, and then open it up for questions. So if I can share my screen, am I a co-host? I'm not sure, but let's see. Yeah, it looks like I can share my screen. So that's all good news. Hold on. It's always a moment online. Here we are.
Good, we can see it. You may want
Excellent.
to go to, present to view, perfect.
Okay, so as I said, you know, or as Dr. Gidwani said, this is a signature project of ours. And before I go any further, let me just disclose that I have an equity interest in a very small privately held data company, which someday may actually have some revenue. But it is focused on some of the same kind of analytic issues that I'll talk about a little bit. It's completely separate. I don't really work with or for them, but I made an early investment. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our methods and in the results I will share with you. And I'll spend a little time talking about the strengths and weaknesses of the claims-based method that we've used. I think there's a lot to say about what we didn't include, what we would love to include. And then there are areas of policy that I think are worth pointing to, that that's not the main focus of what I'll discuss today. So as Dr. Gidwani said, this is Dr. Bernard Lown. He's leaning against one of the first working defibrillators, DC defibrillators, that was commercially available in the world, published in JAMA, I think it's 61 or 62, a new method for terminating cardiac arrhythmias. And, you know, after that, in the 60s and 70s, he was really one of the, you know, top three in the world, particularly around issues of arrhythmias and sudden death, but always had a contrarian view about some things. For instance, the rate of and indications for bypass surgery, which he thought back in the 70s was being overused. And he pioneered a very non-invasive method of treating both sudden death patients without EP studies and coronary patients as long as they were stable. And that's the training I received. And that's a whole other area in the history of cardiology that would be wonderful to explore sometime. But I want to talk a little bit about our hospital index. And to start, I just want to pull back, as I said, and just think a little more about hospitals themselves. Like, what are they? Who are they? When did they start? And so, of course, you know, Homo sapiens has been on the planet, depending on who you talk to, you know, probably at least 100,000 years. And, you know, in the early days, we had no settlements. We didn't have hospitals. We probably had shamans. Most of what they did was probably placebo. There may have been some herbal remedies, but there were certainly, you know, social support and a kind of general feeling of social networking that probably contributed to everyone's sense of well-being. But it was when we settled and had agriculture, had irrigation, had taxes, had kings, that we also see cities form and we see hospitals form. Now, the earliest, you know, are probably not really hospitals, but there were temples in ancient Egypt where it appears there were sort of ill people who showed up. There may have been special religious ceremonies. There may have been priests who specialized in this area. We don't know much, except we know that much. And it's kind of logical that that might have happened. By the time we get to Greece, of course, it's well defined. The Temple of Asclepius had a lot of written documentation. And from that documentation, we know that people gathered. They did invoke the gods, but they also invoked something that sounds very much like hypnosis. And there are records of surgical procedures like draining of an abscess and some even abdominal surgeries in which the patient without anesthesia underwent a dreamlike state and the procedure was performed. The Romans had hospitals, but kind of almost typical cliche of what Romans were. They were focused mostly on the military and military life. I'm sure there were others, but we don't know a lot about them. And in ancient India, in the city of Paliputra, which was the largest city in the world around 400 AD, 500 AD, Chinese travelers went and documented that, the city was prosperous, clean, maybe cleaner than today. And in fact, there were hospitals that took care of the poor and took care of them for free. So that concept of caring and kind of being outside of the money exchange is pretty ancient. Now, what's interesting is that in Europe, early hospitals like Hôtel Dieu in Paris, I think it was 829 AD or thereabouts, were more about the worship. There was usually a clergyman. Patients were expected to perform religious ceremonies. That was almost one of their central functions. But decades earlier in Baghdad, the concept of the modern hospital first emerged. And it's quite recognizable. There were specialty departments. There was an inpatient and an outpatient division. Clinicians did rounds. Medical students followed clinicians, senior clinicians around on rounds. Care was secular, Islamic, non-Islamic, it didn't matter. Care was essentially free. There were actually foundations that were funded and supported care. And interestingly, in Baghdad in that century, the 9th century AD, provincial authorities required medical exams and certification before physicians could practice in the hospital. It took 1,000 years before Europe took that on after the French Revolution in Paris around 1800. So quite far advanced at the time. And I just realized one of those things you don't want to happen. I'm just going to plug in my laptop. My apologies, I've been on the run today. But I don't want to die in the middle of it. So the modern hospital begins really to be created with the rise of the merchant class in England and the United States. These were so-called voluntary hospitals. So wealthy people would band together, fund and construct hospitals like Guy's in London. Guy was a guy, Sir Thomas Guy, and he helped fund Guy's Hospital, Westminster Hospital there. And in this country, Bellevue was founded in 1736. A little while later, Pennsylvania Hospital in Philadelphia, and the Mass General, several decades later. And through the 19th century, hospitals developed in the way we know them. Nursing became more professionalized. There was a little bit more training, a proliferation of medical schools. And then this guy came along. Many of you will have heard of Abraham Flexner. He wrote this report about American healthcare where he talked about the need for science in the European style and the fact that there was too much quackery and that we really needed to transform medical education. And his report was highly influential. Rockefeller and Carnegie had funded it, and they helped promote a transformation of American medical education and American hospitals affiliated. So a lot of the modern academic medical centers have their origin in that period. And while a lot of that was a net positive, it is also the case that that laid the groundwork for what we see today, both for good and I would argue a little bit for ill. And it may be time to rethink some of those things. But this is kind of the progeny of Flexner, if you will. This is science and technology. This is the medicine we all practice. Dr. Lown, was kind of one of the leaders of this big transformation, technological transformation that we've seen. In fact, I have a copy of an interesting letter from the chief of the Cleveland Clinic to Dr. Lown, thanking him for the defibrillator because it made the Cleveland Clinic really possible, you know, the huge numbers of surgery that became possible, cardiac surgery. But with all of this, there is, of course, this other nagging issue, and it's certainly in the forefront of health policy people around the country. And it's something that clinicians, as much as we might want to focus directly on our patient, really need to be more aware of what's going on, what the cross currents are, and how to navigate them. And though correlation is not causation, this is when the Flexner report came out. And of course, it's correlated with a transformation of the US economy, greater industrialization, rising wealth in general. But the share of GDP is, of course, a big problem. And it is a growing problem. And this just illustrates a little bit about what's happened. This is in the hospital sector after World War II. And this tracks a few trends. One of them is number of hospitals, they've actually gone down a bit. Another is number of beds, they've gone down a lot. But what hasn't gone down is the intensity of any given bed. And those of you, you know, this department in critical care is obviously an apt place to think about this, but the full-time equivalent per bed has been rising steadily. And of course, add the labor that involves as well as the technology. And then you get the cost per diem, which has been a major, major issue in health policy. Now, many people have looked at the US and other countries. This is a plot of life expectancy and per capita spending. And the US is clearly an outlier. And it's a stunning fact. But when people have examined this, you know, do we do more caths? Do we do more back surgeries? You know, do we keep people in hospital longer? Net, it doesn't appear that the US is dramatically overutilized or at all. But what is different is clearly that our prices are much, much higher. And that's something that is its own topic. I'm not going to talk about it, but I just wanted to set the stage because as we start thinking about what we do to improve healthcare today, we cannot talk about it without thinking about the pricing, the costs, and how are we going to actually deliver high quality healthcare in the country. Now, this graph is important to understand because the US was not always an outlier. This is, I think, a profound picture because what it shows is that back in sometime 1975-ish, the US was in the pack with all the other advanced countries. And sometime around 78, 80, it really veered off and went off in this other direction. And that is a dramatic fact, and that is not baked into our DNA. That is not baked into, 200 years of history, but it may be baked by certain other forces that are well worth understanding. And it wasn't just in the United States. So around 1980, Deng Xiaoping came to power in China. And while this phrase has been attributed to him, it's probably apocryphal. Maybe he said it, maybe he didn't. But even in communist China, the idea was, we got to make a buck. And that was definitely true in this country. This is a well-known actor from a movie of the 1980s. And here's a clip from that illustrates what I'm talking about.
The point is, ladies and gentlemen, that greed, for lack of a better word, is good. Greed is right. Greed works. Greed clarifies, cuts through, and captures the essence of the evolutionary spirit. Greed in all of its forms. Greed for life, for money, for love, knowledge, has marked the upward surge of mankind, and greed, you mark my words, will not only save Teldar paper, but that other malfunctioning corporation called the USA. Thank you very much.
So the writer, screenwriter, and the director probably thought they were offering a criticism of Wall Street, and maybe they were. But from the perspective of 25 years later, this actually seems to encapsulate a change in attitude and culture, definitely a change in policy. That's a whole other conversation about healthcare policy and the changes that happened at that time. But one of them really revolved around the notion that the individual patient, is an individual actor in a marketplace and can take their business wherever they can. They should have skin in the game to offer market pressure to hospitals and others to lower their prices, which still hasn't happened, to improve care and create competition. And I would argue that really hasn't happened the way it was supposed to. And so in many ways, after 25 years, that whole frame, in my own view, personal opinion really, is that we're at a dead end. And in such a dead end, there are other important things to take into account. Now, this has played out a lot in the public domain with discussions and debates about what's happened to the economy. These are major issues during presidential campaigns between, Obama and his opponent. It's also the case with Trump and his opponent, also the case with Biden and Trump. And so these are not necessarily new to anybody, but the consequences for healthcare are notable and worth making note of, which is when you have such a large population experiencing a fall, a decline in wages and in that kind of precariousness in their life, when health insurance is tied to employment, and when the type of medical insurance you can get is a function of what you can afford, then there are consequences, and some of them are around who are the populations we serve, how do they pay for things, and in this model of individual as consumer, you have rising copays and deductibles, so you have rising amounts of medical debt, and that puts pressure on health systems and hospitals and others, providers in general. And in a sense, it's kind of all falling from this change in the American economy and the failure of a healthcare system to reform and adapt to it. And in such a moment, really, this type of crisis, as an Italian philosopher and political activist said, the old is dying and the new cannot be born, and a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. And I think that's some of what we see these days. We at the Lown Institute recognize that with our Shkreli Awards. Martin Shkreli, actually went to jail for fraud around hedge fund investing, but in fact, he quintupled the price of Daraprim because he could, and it really wasn't illegal. And so in a sense, he epitomizes a lot of what's happening in healthcare that's not illegal, but boy, it makes you scratch your head or just shake your head. And every year we go through the media reports and pick winners of the Shkreli Awards. And here's some past winners. And these were tourists from, I think, Korea, and I think they were just shocked when they got the bill. There's been press coverage of the fact that there are a lot of hospitals, often not known by the CEO, but a lot of hospitals and billing departments are suing patients, garnishing wages, seizing houses, and quite often it is for egregiously small amounts of money. And this is, again, the business model in which hospitals depend on specific volume-based, transactional pieces to get revenue. This is not properly labeled. It really should say refuse to take uninsured or underinsured COVID patients. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal with leaked emails from the West Coast indicating that certain hospitals had empty ICU beds and had empty beds in general. Hospitals down the road were inundated with COVID patients, and this was the behavior we saw. Again, it's rational from the business model point of view, not rational for society as a whole. And this is just a month or two ago. And there's a lot of trends like this. There's a trend for obstetrical EDs, emergency departments. There are wings of other EDs and a lot of routine Obstetrical care is kind of funneled that way, and it's a sort of revenue model. So the question for all of us is really, what kind of healthcare do we want in the country? Who are we as a people? What do we want for healthcare? And those of you who are fans of Foundation, either the books or the recent Apple TV series, Harry Seldon was this psychohistorian and mathematician who predicted the collapse of the Galactic Empire. This is a prototype actually for Star Wars, but the books are out in the 60s. And also predicted how we might shorten the dark ages in between, and that was by starting to seed a new system. If you don't like that analogy, there's Buckminster Fuller, a famous, brilliant genius, American inventor, who said, you know, if you want to change reality, make the old model obsolete. And I think there's a lot of truth in that, though fighting the existing reality may be a requirement as well. So after that long introduction, let's talk about the hospital index. I think you have the right context. We thought of this as changing the conversation. We thought what we wanted to do was reframe what it means to be a great hospital. So our work around the hospitals index, we think, lands within these three pillars: health equity, high value care, and accountability. And so in a sense, 100 years after Flexner, we're asking this question: can we reframe what it means to be a great hospital? So we looked at a number of things. We looked at the things that are pretty well reported: mortality, readmissions, patient satisfaction, which is problematic. I mean, the HCAHPS things are problematic, patient safety. But then there are things that we really have pioneered: avoiding overuse, cost efficiency, which was new this year, racial and economic class inclusivity. And I'll go through these in detail. The asterisk under US News denotes the fact that this year, for the first time, US News has started using one of the Lown overuse metrics in their assessment of hospital surgical quality. We put together an advisory committee. It consisted both of community activists, some hospital CEOs, some journalists, some academic researchers. It's a good group. They really made a difference, and I think helped steer us in the right direction. Clearly, we have a point of view. Clearly, the stuff I'm going to show you is coming from that point of view, but I think it's grounded in evidence and data, and these folks really helped us stay on that path. This is the hierarchical structure of the data and the report. The highest level we call the social responsibility index. But within each of the three pillars of equity, value, and outcomes, there are subgroups, and we can talk in detail about them. And I think we have time to do that. But the data sources are all public. We use Medicare data, we use claims data, we use Bureau of Labor Statistics data. We also use census data. We get IRS forms downloaded, we process them. There's a range of things we put together and link. We have access to 100% of the Medicare files. And you know, in the world of big data, that may be the biggest database in the world. I'm not sure, but I know it's about 250 billion lines of data. And so for community benefits, we actually talk about how tax-exempt dollars are spent. We also look at pay equity. We look at what's the CEO making, what are the non-professional workers making, look at the ratio. And inclusivity, which I'll focus on a little bit. We look at how do hospitals serve people in their community, particularly people of color or with lower incomes or education. For value, as I said, avoiding overuse, we look at 12 metrics that are widely accepted to be extremely low value. We and others have over the last 10 years developed long lists. I'm not sure how useful they've become, but last count, one research group had something like 2,500 to 3,500 individual low value services. We elected to pick those that we thought were attributable to hospitals and that represented, one in which the debate about the evidence would be least. We also developed a cost efficiency metric where we look Again, this is Medicare, and so it's not really about price. Prices are standardized except for regional cost of living differences. So we back calculate the standard, but we add up all the various service lines, whether it's home health, nursing home, outpatient follow-up visits, et cetera. And then we look at what kind of outcome. We use mortality. In the future, we'll use others. What kind of outcome for how much utilization as a measure of cost efficiency? We also report mortality. We use a risk adjustment method called the risk stratification index that was developed by colleagues of ours at the old company I was involved with, Aspect Medical Systems. We also use an all conditions model, and we adjust for case mix, but we just take all comers. And we sometimes, we have the capacity for longer follow-up times, which I suppose would be debatable whether or not you all would want to be held accountable for 1-year outcomes. I suspect not. But from a health system point of view, we thought it was useful and interesting to have that available and to begin to think about how to use them. And the risk adjustment we use, it performs better, certainly at using a simple metric like C statistic or area under the curve. This is the ROC curve for our method versus CMS's method using hierarchical condition categories. We get about a C statistic of about 0.89 for 30-day mortality. So this is Mount Sinai's results. All of this is available on our website, which is lownhospitalsindex.org. And what we're showing is a national ranking, a state ranking, an overall grade. This is kind of the, how can I put it? This is the journalistic side of what we're doing in order to try to capture people's interest and awareness and attention. But if we look under the hood, when we look at outcomes, we can do that for each individual hospital. And again, these are the Mount Sinai results using our metric. And, you can make of them what you will. Here are the value metrics for Mount Sinai. Both avoiding overuse and cost efficiency are A's. Mount Sinai does very well in this area. And then this is the metric for equity. This includes both pay equity, community benefit, and inclusivity. And you'll see it's a little bit scattered. Pay equity in particular, large academic medical centers pay their CEOs very, very well. And so large academic medical centers tend to not do as well on this ranking. We made a choice early on to have everybody compared on the same playing field. And in that sense, smaller hospitals that don't pay their CEOs as much, hospitals that are even medium size would probably do better on this metric than big city academic medical centers. Community benefit is an interesting one, and one that's triggered some debate and probably will continue to do so. And I'll show you what we do, but we do not count training for physicians. And we also don't count research. And so again, academic medical centers typically don't do as well because of that, though Mount Sinai does very well. And we also look at charity care. And I can talk about why we don't include those, but this is not an idiosyncratic view. There are many, many people who view both the tax write-off from physician training and the tax write-off from research as a questionable direct community benefit, though it is legal and the IRS certainly doesn't say anything about it. And inclusivity is the one we'll talk about a little bit more. And that's one also that I will say Mount Sinai doesn't do well. New York hospitals, New York is a city that is highly, highly unequal. I probably don't need to tell any of you that. But the degrees of inequality, both in terms of residential segregation, kind of income disparities, and in hospital utilization are pretty dramatic compared to many other parts of the country. And I think that's what we're seeing here. So we do these regular launches, and we did a community benefit launch this past year. We also did a racial inclusivity launch, and that's available on video. And I might recommend you see that. But here's what we did. We looked at charity care. We looked at all the community investing that a hospital reported to the IRS. And then we calculated an estimate of the tax exemption the hospital enjoys. And we asked the question, is the tax exemption that citizens are essentially providing hospitals, is that somehow getting paid back or given back through this mechanism of charity care, community investment, and the like? And we calculate that as a surplus or deficit. And so this is an example of, this is the estimate of the tax exemption that Mount Sinai Hospital enjoys and that New York Presbyterian Hospital enjoys. And here's the estimate, not the estimate, here's the reporting on the community benefit spending that we count. And so you can see Mount Sinai does well, and that's why Mount Sinai gets an A on our community benefit scorecard. New York Presbyterian, not so much. Similarly, we did a racial inclusivity launch, and that video I think is well worth a watch if you have any interest. We had Harriet Washington. She's a, excuse me, she's a public intellectual is probably the best way of putting it. She is really a remarkable person who's written a lot of books, but one of them called Medical Apartheid is well worth your time. And she talks a lot. She lives in New York, and she talks about experiences in New York and New York hospitals that I think are very germane. We also had, last year, we had Aletha Maybank, who's now leading the equity effort at the AMA. So these are all available. And so here are the inclusivity maps for Mount Sinai. So let's start at the top right. What we do is we take all the patients that we have in the data set. Again, remember, this is Medicare. So these are the over 65 patients. And we use an algorithm to sort by which zip codes contribute how many patients. And we rank order that. And when we get out to zip codes where the marginal additional contribution is diminishing to the point of nothingness, we draw a line. It's algorithmic. But at that line, we look at the zip codes around that, and then we plot them. And the one that has the furthest distance, we define as the radius of the community area. And so that circle represents the community area using this method. The second plot, the middle plot, now plots within that community area. Remember, all of them contributed to the hospital, but some zip codes contributed a lot more than others. So that middle map shows you the zip codes that really contributed a lot compared to the other zip codes that contributed very little or less. And then the third one is really, I think, sorry, it's truncated, but the third one is a map of, from the census, of the percentage of Black Americans over the age of 65 within the catchment area that we've previously defined. And it's a little hard to see, but it's not news. I mean, anybody who knows New York, lives in New York, I've lived in New York, it's not news, but you know what you have here is the darker areas are where there's a greater percentage of African Americans. But when you look at the zip codes that are contributing to Mount Sinai, it's not at all congruent with that, right? And so when we do that for all the hospitals, we can calculate a range of differences. So these are all the hospitals. These are the grades we gave them. And this kind of illustrates the New York issue, which is, you know, we got a lot of A's and a lot of D's. We don't have a lot of B's and C's, which is, I think, about inequality. This shows the community area income that we've calculated. And it shows that, you know, the community area for a place like, you know, Harlem Hospital is 36,000, so it's lower compared to many others. But the patient income within that hospital is lower still. Whereas other hospitals like Lenox Hill, for example, the community area is, you know, higher than Harlem Hospital, but the inpatient estimated income is substantially higher. And so that's what drives this method, looking at the differences. And we do the same. This is an aggregate of people of color, so that includes Black, Hispanic, and other minorities. There are not that many others. Asian Americans are included. And again, the method allows these sorts of calculations. Now, one thing I'll say about our method is that when we do that math, each individual racial category is calculated separately, and it's sort of using a chi-squared method. And what that means is if a hospital really caters to the Black community, but there's Hispanic community right next to it and it's not catering to it, it will get low marks. And that doesn't happen often because, you know, the social gradient, the income gradient often makes up for that. But it does on occasion. We had a hospital in Chicago where they actually had a lower inclusivity score than they thought they deserved. And when we looked at it with them and looked at the demographics, it turned out there was a significant Hispanic community, not right next to the hospital, but, you know, not that far, that somehow wasn't coming there. And that just reflected a reality. And our goal was to reflect these realities without necessarily being prescriptive about whether that's right or wrong or what we should do about it. But of course, you know, in New York, you know, if you take the Metropolitan Hospital and you take Lenox Hill, the top and the bottom, 13 minutes by subway, depending on traffic, 20 minutes by car. This is the percentage of people of color in the community area of the two hospitals. And this is the percentage of the inpatient population as we've calculated it. So you can see that, you know, in Lenox Hill is much lower than their area, Metropolitan is much higher than their area. So we've attracted notice. We've gotten quite a bit of media coverage, both in the general press, USA Today being, you know, a prominent one, the Post, the Inquirer, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, a bunch of them. We've been mentioned in the New England Journal, Stat, and in the trade press pretty regularly, Becker's, Hospital Review, and Modern Healthcare. And so we're now in conversations with various hospitals, both with research groups and with sometimes with management. You know, there are hospitals that are delighted that a lot of the work they've been trying to do, serving their underserved communities, is getting recognized. And we're delighted that they're delighted. That is certainly part of what we hope to do, which was, as I said, reframe what it means to be a great hospital. But there are lots of limitations. We don't have bricks and mortar level claims data. What I mean by that is there are not a lot, but several hundred hospitals that send one billing number, and that's the claim we get. But they have clearly two, occasionally three, usually two campuses. Sometimes they're near each other. Sometimes they're not near each other. They may or may not have, you know, differentiated certain service lines in one campus, others at another. We can't resolve that, so that's an issue. The effects of consolidation on community benefit spending make it really hard. Quite often when hospitals are bought and turned into these huge systems, the system reports community benefit spending to the IRS, and we can't really necessarily resolve at the local level. We try. We use some prorating methods, some imputation methods. It would be great to have income and education at the patient level. We have it at the zip code level. We could have it at the census tract level, but CMS will not allow us to have census tract level identifiers of patients due to patient confidentiality concerns. And so we can only resolve to the zip code level. And that makes it hard. But if we had patient level data, even if it was anonymized at the zip code level, that would, I think, go a long way to sharpen or make more precise what we're doing. We would love to have commercial data. There's a lot of variability in commercial, and clearly pricing varies a lot in commercial data. But that information has been jealously guarded. It's been the subject of enormous political debate. The Trump administration issued a rule requiring hospitals to report on the pricing of, you know, their top, 100 services, something like that. The American Hospital Association challenged that, lost it in the courts, and it is now the law of the land. But many, many hospitals are simply not complying because the penalties are so slight. And what we do know already is the variability in pricing is dramatic, which is how you get these news stories of, gallbladder surgery, costing $5,000 here and $50,000 there. There's lots of data we'd love, like commercial data. We think there's probably merit in understanding capital allocation decisions, especially when we think about racial inclusivity, decisions that are made about which practice to acquire, where you site a facility, where you're trying to advertise. Those are all relevant questions. Primary care versus specialty care is an important one. We're looking at different ways of doing that. In New York, it was suggested to us we look at family visitation policies as just a metric of patient friendliness. And I think one of the New York foundations did a study and recommended this. I don't know that it's gone very far. And it's the kind of thing I think you all in critical care probably would have an opinion on, but I think it is also the kind of thing that would be more directly related to the nature of care in your setting, as opposed to the broader issues that I've been talking about. And there are policies on data we'd love to have. We'd like to see community health needs assessments directly linked to reporting, so that the tax deduction that nonprofits claim and that they document their community spending on could be linked directly to community health needs, though there are problems even with these community health needs assessments. We think an all payer claims database nationally would absolutely be heaven for researchers, but it's not the kind of thing we're going to get in the near term, I don't think. And then these are highly debatable, but my own perspective, and I should say my other disclosure is that, I'm Canadian. I went to a Canadian medical school. And so, when I look at these variations that we see and a lot of the problems we see, I think global budgets based on population rates and some kind of reference pricing, whether it's a single payer model or some other, would go a long way to driving improvement. And certainly from a racial equity point of view, the disparities and discrepancies in reimbursement and compensation that providers achieve, whether or not they're catering to one type of patient or another type of patient, one demographic or another, really are part of what drives some of the disparities we see. They're not the only one, but they're part of it. A lot of it is deeper, it's cultural, it's historical, it's behavioral. Because the data I showed you, I'll remind you, they're all Medicare patients. That means Black, Hispanic, white, whatever. The revenue model is identical and the reimbursement is identical. So there are legacy behavioral issues as well. And probably that's true on both sides, both in terms of patients and communities and in terms of hospitals. So I'm going to stop there. I hope I've generated enough question material, and we'll be delighted to answer questions or have a further conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Saini, for really a deep dive into methodology. Some stuff that you're doing is very unique and quite different from some of the other people, such as US News, etc. But quite importantly, equally importantly, is our shared interest in Isaac Asimov and Apple TV's new series, which I find quite remarkable. And in that vein, I will tell you that just as there is so much tension there between the various forces, I think that at Mount Sinai, it's a unique place. And the reason I can say that is I have worked at Metropolitan for a little bit at Lenox, and then here for the longest period at Mount Sinai. And they're all situated at a very interesting cataclysmic line, that is the 96th Street. Now, 96th Street historically divides some of the wealthiest zip codes, the Upper East Side, from some of the poorest zip codes, plagued with probably one of the greatest asthma incidence sites, that is in East Harlem. And we are on 98th Street. In 1995 or 6, I was at Metropolitan, and that line was pretty much an impenetrable barrier. Today, with gentrification and all stuff has moved up. Point being that when you compare the community income with the income of the patients in the hospital, you get a skewed picture, because Sinai geographically sits in East Harlem, but its patients come from the poorest and the wealthiest zip codes. Some of the titans of industry, entertainment, finance, journalism come here, and some of the most dispossessed come here. So that the hospital income that you show may be somewhat higher than the geographic location where we are. How do you adjust for things? This is obviously a very unique, or maybe not very unique. There is an American term, across the railroad tracks, so it must apply throughout the nation. How does one, adjust for that? So that is, of course, looking at the nitty gritty of some of these methodologies, but overall, what a fantastic effort that only a Canadian could have undertaken.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm delighted with our shared interest in Asimov. And, we may have to work with you as a consultant, since you probably have unique insight from these 3 hospital experiences. I mean, your point is well taken, but to answer your question, it is not unique to New York. New York, it's more pronounced, but it's really practically every American city. And in a sense, what you outlined is in fact probably part of the underlying driver of all of this, which is residential segregation. If you look at the history of redlining, which is getting another look now in the last few years with the upsurge of willingness to confront the legacy of racism in the country, it is not all due to or from the behavior of the hospital. But having said that, if you were a Martian landing and looking at this situation, how would anybody rationally explain this? Or if I were to put it a different way, would we ever put 2 airports 5 blocks apart, one for blacks and one for whites? I mean, as soon as you pose it that way, the kind of ridiculousness of it comes out, though clearly it's not any one person's fault, or it's not even one policy. But it is clear that we have work to do.
Indeed. Anyone else has questions for Dr. Saini? Okay, let me ask you another question. Where are you going with this? The bigger question, where are you going with this?
Great question. So we're, number one, we're refining all of our metrics. So in the case of inclusivity, the biggest change this coming year is, instead of using a mechanical geographic radius, we're actually going to use a travel time radius, which is a little more realistic. It turns out it doesn't change things hugely, but it's a little more defensible, and it adds a little bit of precision, mostly in the edge cases, like when there's a hospital or a city or a neighborhood that's on the seashore and there's nothing on that side, everything's on one side, or it's up against the mountains where to go over the mountains and get to that hospital would not be possible. Travel time will filter that out. So that's one thing we're doing. We're improving our risk adjustment on mortality by, we have a few additional things we're going to be doing to improve case mix, because the percent of elective surgeries, even with case mix adjustment, turns out to be a significant driver of mortality. It's not a surprise. But what was surprising to me looking across the country is the number of hospitals that are highly regarded where the percent of their surgery that's elective is stupendously high. I'm talking 85, 90, 95% of all their surgery is elective surgery. Mount Sinai is not one of them, but there are others. And I think that actually gives them a bit of an unfair advantage. So those are, the areas. We have a few other things we'd like to do. We've been approached to add other things to the index. We're now working on equity measures in the outpatient side, looking at, Medicaid patients in relationship to clinic visits, and looking at the differentiation between primary and specialty care. We're creating a consortium of research hospitals. We're working on with this in partnership with the Center for Equity of the American Medical Association, the AMA. And so there's at least half a dozen hospitals that are going to be represented, and we're in the midst of putting that research group together. So there's a lot of action.
Thank you. I'm sure we're going to have you back. You're a provocative speaker doing very cool stuff, and a proud socialist, I see. May I use that word? But seriously, I think a lot of us, a lot of the young docs, truly believe in a kinder, gentler healthcare system for America, a more equitable system for healthcare for this country.
Thank you. I will be delighted to come back. I'm delighted to field questions that come up later, and let's be in touch. Thank you.
Thank you very much.